Well, they brush Zoya's fears aside. The professor says, come now, young woman, get hold of yourself. We have to do this in the name of science. We have to do this in the name of producing a better world. The ice is thawed, and Persipkin wakes up and says, my God, where am I? Where is this? And when he finds out that 50 years have gone by, he says, my gosh, my party dues. I haven't paid my party dues for what am I going to do? He tries to rush out to find a taxi. They stop him. They show him that he's in an entirely different kind of world now. He doesn't have to worry about party dues. He doesn't have to worry about taxis. As a matter of fact, in this new world, they have trees that can produce different kinds of fruit on demand. Tangerines one day, pears the next day. It's a wonderful world. People walk around in groups in perfect harmony. There's nothing to worry about. There are no problems to worry about. There's no exploitation. This is that ideal future utopia of the communist world that he's talking about. But Persipkin brings a disease far more powerful than the wonders of the brave new communist world. He's got something with him that's a mixture that's toxic in large doses and repulsive in small ones. It's a substance which can overcome all of this marvelously organized regime of the new world. This new substance name is beer. Persipkin simply cannot live without a swig of beer, and of course when they get the smell of beer, they say, good heavens, what are these terrible alcoholic fumes that he's bringing upon us? The previously well-organized society is now almost totally corrupted by Persipkin's introduction of alcohol fumes. But even more serious than the alcohol fumes of Persipkin, and all of the terrible things, he tries to put a picture of his girlfriend up on the wall, and lo and behold, he can't even put a thumbtack on the wall because all the walls are metal and glass. You can't put a thumbtack into metal and glass. What kind of a society is this where you can't even thumb a picture of your girlfriend up on the wall? You begin to understand that that future ideal society may not be quite so ideal as people's imagination pictured it back in Mayakovsky's time. But even more seriously, the bedbug escapes detection. And the whole of future society is launched in a mock heroic expedition to bring the bedbug back for scientific observation. They have the perfect scientific description for it in Persipkin, bedbugus normalis and bourgeoisius vulgaris. And very, very carefully, but with huge masses of people, they go step by step after the bedbug. Now be careful, they say, when you find the bedbug, don't go upon him too soon because you might crush him. Take very, very good care of the bedbug because we want to have him for our study. We want to have him for the future world. We want to know what that old world was like and how our world is much better than the bedbug. And so you get this mock crusade to save the bedbug. And of course, by this time, Persipkin's managed to infect the whole new world with his old diseases of sloth, alcoholism, loose language, and even looser love. And curiously enough, although he's introducing what they see as vice into the society, these old things are not things that either we or Mayakovsky or we approve of. We begin to realize that the same Persipkin, who was such an obnoxious no-goodnik back in the first part of the book, looks rather appealing, in contrast to a utopian future world that lacks the warmth and interest of human feelings and passions, no matter how filled they are with officially defined vice. You begin to realize that this Mayakovsky, who had been a loyal socialist and one who thirsted for communism and one who thirsted for the future, is really somebody very deeply attached to the past. And Persipkin, with his bad habits, with his alcohol, with his bedbug, with his terrible doggerel poetry, with all the bad things that he had from the old world, with his attempts to exploit people, with his vulgar materialist worship of wealth, Persipkin begins to look rather appealing. This same Persipkin, who is a total obnox in the first part of the story, is suddenly becoming a dear relic of the past which one should hold on to for dear life. Well, it's clear that the bedbug has to be placed in the zoo. And of course, Persipkin is having a terrible time living without his bedbug, and suddenly he finds a notice that says the bedbug is in the zoo. He says, oh, at last I can get back to my friend, and he rushes off to the zoo. And so, in the last scene, Persipkin and the bedbug are in a cage in the zoo together. He's in a cage together with his bad habits, and the cage with the bad habits and the bedbug is one of the most famous scenes from dramaturgy in Soviet times. Well, of course, the whole world of the future has heard that Persipkin and his bedbug are now to be seen in the zoo, and so they march off to the zoo in precise order. They march like an army to the zoo. The children are let out from school. They're marching happily. They're singing in perfect harmony, just the way the city of the future should do. To go to the zoo to look at this creature from another world, look at this bedbug in the cage. And, of course, they listen to a harangue from the chairman of the city Soviet, that is the city council, and the chief zookeeper. The burden of their talk is look at the disgusting nature of the two specimens of the people you're about to see. Mayakovsky pulls out all the rhetorical stops about the disgusting nature not only of the bourgeoisie, but of those who call themselves proletarians, but act like bourgeoisie. They're dressed like penguins in formal clothes. They make a tremendous noise after they hear music at the opera and at the symphony, but of course they make terrible stuff that should go in the toilet, but instead goes on the floor just like birds. The curtain is lifted from the cage, and we observe Prusipkin with his friend, the bedbug. He's playing that same guitar, singing the same song we heard when he was sitting unconcerned with his friends who were giving him hell in the first act, but now we understand his charm, the warmth of the former world. The keeper goes to unlock the cage, revolver in hand. Now, you understand that this was done in the very early 1930s, when there was a premonition of the terrible forced labor camps that were in a very few years going to be instituted by the Stalinist regime. The zookeeper holding a gun to Prusipkin shows the Soviet audience what they're in for. And of course, many people had a sense of what was in the offing. This scene is a terribly grim scene, and because of the scene, of course, the play was enacted on the stage exactly one time in Mayakovsky's lifetime, and couldn't be enacted again until many, many years later in the 1950s after the death of Stalin. This references the Soviet forced labor camps, through which millions and tens of millions experienced the nature of Soviet imprisonment, and in no small number of cases, execution. One shivers, that is, when one was in the theater at that time, one shivered to see what was there. Prusipkin sitting in the cage with his guitar, the bedbug by his side, the people around him, people of the future who had no understanding of what people of the past were like, no understanding of the kind of warmth, no understanding of the kind of chaos, no understanding of the kind of creativity, no understanding of all of those things in the old world which we, that is, if we were socialists, we argued against. We harangued against, we made speeches against, but at the same time had within themselves a genuine human warmth, a genuine human quality that was going to be completely lost in this future of steel and glass and a totally inanimate state. And then, unexpectedly, Prusipkin jumps out of the cage and rushes forward to address the audience in the real theater. Now you understand, the people in the real theater are in Mayakovsky's time. He addresses them as his own and asks them, how they returned from a frozen state. How did you get here? Friends, people just like I am. How in the devil did you get here? Did they unfreeze you the same way they unfroze me? Why am I suffering? Why is this going on? Friends, countrymen, help me get out of this. And of course, again, this is a cry that to the ears of people in the theater had a very grim and a very prophetic message. This was something that Mayakovsky was dealing with real prescience about what was going to happen in the future of the Soviet Union. Well, Prusipkin is dragged off by the zoo attendants. And the zookeeper orders the playing of a march. There's a rather nasty irony here, because you may remember in the Nazi concentration camps, they often marched the people to the gas chambers under the sounds of an orchestra, the playing of a march. The grim and prophetic message is not hard to understand, and that's why the play was banned from the Soviet stage in Stalinist Russia. As I said before, only after 1953 and the death of Stalin could the performance of the play be revived. Mayakovsky's own attitude toward the regime comes out, I think, rather clearly in this play. He's disgusted by the degree of sycophancy and lying promulgated by this very regime which he himself had been so eager to establish. Its notion of the great new communist utopia toward which the socialist regime would strive was one would lead to an imprisonment of the human spirit rather than the creative awakening the poet had wanted to see. Mayakovsky was obviously in considerable pain here, although you never would have guessed it by his public actions. This play is full of what must have been going on very painfully and very deeply within Mayakovsky himself. His last years were very painful. He had to watch his reputation sink and listened to the exultant accusations of his enemies. There were people who claimed that he wasn't really a communist, that he only wanted to get to his Paris, to his woman. He had to watch a society getting more and more distant from his early ideals. Some 6 years earlier, the poet Yesenin, who had been a very, very popular poet in the Soviet Union at that time, had eventually committed suicide, but before he committed suicide, he wrote a poem with his own blood, saying that it may not have been a new thing to die, but it wasn't any newer to live. And Mayakovsky, of course, people were quite shocked by the suicide of Yesenin at that time, because Yesenin was a tremendously popular poet, a tremendously prominent and important figure in the Soviet world. Mayakovsky, in rather bad taste, answered that poem of Yesenin's with a poem of his own, saying, yes, it may be difficult to commit suicide, but it's even more difficult to live in this life, and one should live in this life. One should struggle with the world. One should not give in. So the shock was even greater in 1930, when the news came out that Mayakovsky had played Russian roulette with himself, that is, putting one bullet in the chamber of a pistol, then whirling the barrel, so you didn't know whether the bullet was near the firing pin or not. And this time, this was not the first time he played Russian roulette, but this time he lost, and he killed himself. Of course, it was a tremendous shock to the public to realize the suicide of Mayakovsky. And after his death, then it was very convenient for the Soviet regime to praise him, and Stalin even said that disrespect to his memory was a crime. Recently, there have been claims that, as a matter of fact, that wasn't true, that Mayakovsky was killed by Stalin's security organs. I haven't seen any conclusive proof of that story, although I know that many Russians believe it. He did leave a short final poem, one of his best. It starts out with the quiet of the night, talking about love's boat which is smashed not on the dashing rocks, as Romeo says in his famous final lines in Shakespeare, but against what the Russians call byt, the daily experience that all of us know. Mayakovsky then ends with an exquisite quatrain, perhaps the best he ever wrote. Ты посмотри, какая в мире тишь, ночь обложила небо звездной данью. Такие вот часы, встаешь и говоришь векам, истории и мироизданию. Just you look at the quiet in the world. Night has laid across the sky a starry tribute. In just such hours, you take a stance and talk to centuries, to history, and to the whole universe. The poet, who considered himself the tribune of the revolution with loud and intrusive manners, turns out to have a lyric voice virtually unmatched in the 20th century. And so this brings us back to the statue of Mayakovsky in what was then called Mayakovsky Square, now once again Triumphal Square, 25 or 30 minutes walk from the Kremlin, where Mayakovsky is standing, the idol of the poets who want to express themselves in a freer way than that Soviet government would allow them to do, that same Soviet government which Mayakovsky had so heartily striven toward.